The glass shattered from Duke Alistair Whitmore's hand before anyone understood what was happening to him. One moment, he stood at the head of the long dining table, raising a toast to his family gathered for his 52nd birthday. The next, his fingers went numb, his vision blurred into streaks of gold candlelight, and his knees buckled beneath him. He hit the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the entire hall, and for a few seconds, nobody moved. Not his wife, not his brother, not his own children. Eliza Hartwell was the first to reach him. She had been standing near the far wall, holding a tray of empty glasses, invisible the way housemaids are trained to be invisible at family dinners. She dropped the tray without thinking, and rushed across the polished floor, kneeling beside the Duke as his body convulsed weakly against the cold stone. "Someone call for the physician!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. But the silence continued a moment too long. It was Margaret Whitmore, the Duke's wife, who finally spoke, and what she said sent a chill through Eliza that she would remember for the rest of her life. Give him space, let him breathe. Not a cry of alarm. Not tears, just a calm, measured instruction, as if she were commenting on the weather. Eliza did not have time to question it. She pressed her fingers to the Duke's neck and found his pulse weak and irregular, fluttering like a bird trapped behind glass. His skin had gone pale and clammy, and a thin froth had gathered at the corner of his mouth. She had seen illness before, growing up in a village where medicine was scarce and death visited often, but she had never seen anything quite like this. "He needs a doctor now," she said again, louder this time, looking up at the family surrounding them. Edmund Whitmore, the Duke's younger brother, stood with his arms folded, his expression unreadable. Charles, the Duke's grown son, glanced toward his mother instead of his father. Louisa, the daughter, had not even risen from her chair. She sat frozen, staring at her wine glass, as though it held more interest than her collapsing father. It was Harold Finch, the estate's aging steward, who finally broke away and rushed toward the corridor to send for the town physician. Eliza stayed on the floor, cradling the Duke's head in her lap, speaking softly to him, even though she doubted he could hear her. "Stay with me, Your Grace. Just stay with me." The physician arrived nearly an hour later, delayed by icy roads and a storm that had rolled in from the hills. By the time he examined the Duke, Alistair had slipped into a state somewhere between sleep and death, his breathing shallow, his body trembling with fever. The physician, a cautious man named Dr. Pell, ran his hands over the Duke's skin, checked his eyes, and asked what he had eaten and drunk that evening. "The same as everyone else," Margaret answered smoothly. "We all had the same meal." Dr. Pell frowned, but said nothing further. He instructed that the Duke be moved to his private chambers and kept warm, and he prescribed a tincture to ease the fever, though his tone suggested he held little hope. Before leaving, he pulled Edmund aside in the hallway, speaking in a low voice that Eliza, carrying linens nearby, could just barely overhear. "This does not look like ordinary illness," the doctor said. "I have seen symptoms like this only once before, in a case of poisoning. I cannot say for certain, but I would advise caution with whatever comes into contact with him going forward." Edmund's face remained still, almost bored. "Thank you, doctor. We will take every precaution." Eliza's hands tightened around the linens she carried. Poisoning. The word settled into her mind and refused to leave. That night, she was assigned to sit with the Duke until midnight, a duty no one else seemed eager to claim. She dabbed his forehead with a cool cloth and listened to his labored breathing, watching his chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven waves. Around 11, she heard voices drifting from the study below, carried faintly up through the old pipes that ran along the walls of the manor. She recognized Margaret's voice first, followed by Edmund's, then Charles. She should have walked away. She told herself later that she should have simply gone about her duties and paid no attention, but something in her would not let her leave. She crept to the small linen closet that shared a wall with the study, a space she had used before to listen for calls from the family late at night. Through the gap beneath the door, the voices came through more clearly. "How long did the physician say?" Charles asked, his voice tight with something that was not grief. "Days, perhaps," Edmund answered. "A week if he fights. He has always been stubborn." "And the documents?" Margaret's voice, cool and businesslike. "Are they in order?" "Everything is prepared," Edmund said. "Once he is gone, the transfer of the title and the estate accounts will proceed exactly as we discussed. There will be no delays, no complications. Eliza's blood turned cold. She pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. "And if he wakes?" Charles asked. "If he recovers?" There was a pause, long and heavy. "He won't," Edmund said finally. "Trust me." Eliza backed away from the door slowly, her heart pounding so loudly, she feared they might hear it through the wall. She returned to the Duke's chamber and sat beside his bed for the remainder of the night, watching him breathe, replaying the conversation in her mind, over and over, until the words lost all meaning except one unmistakable truth. His own family was waiting for him to die, and someone among them may have made certain that he would. The next morning, Margaret announced over breakfast that the family would be relocating to their townhouse in the city. Urgent matters required their attention, she explained. Business affairs that could not wait even during such a difficult time. Charles agreed at once, adding that the change of scenery might do them good, considering the strain of watching Alistair suffer. Louisa said nothing, but she did not object either. Eliza stood near the sideboard, refilling teacups, listening to every word with growing disbelief. "And the Duke?" she finally asked, unable to hold her tongue any longer. Surely someone should stay to care for him. Margaret glanced at her as though noticing her for the first time, an eyebrow raised at the housemaid's boldness. "The staff will manage. Dr. Pell will visit when needed. There is nothing more we can do for him here that cannot be done from the city. With respect, my lady, he needs constant care. His condition—" "Thank you, Eliza," Margaret interrupted, her tone final. "That will be all." Within 2 days, the family had packed their belongings and departed in a convoy of carriages, leaving behind only a skeleton staff to maintain the enormous estate. Harold Finch stayed briefly, but even he received a letter days later summoning him to handle affairs at the family's other properties, leaving the manor with barely enough hands to keep the fires lit, let alone tend to a dying Duke. One by one, the remaining servants found reasons to leave as well. The cook cited family troubles of her own. 2 housemaids departed together, whispering that they had heard rumors the estate itself was cursed, that misfortune followed anyone who stayed too long within its walls. The gardener simply vanished one morning without explanation, his tools left scattered by the shed. Within a week, only Eliza remained. She stood alone in the vast entrance hall one evening, looking up at the portraits of generations of Whitmores lining the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch her with quiet judgment. The manor, once filled with the sound of laughter and footsteps and clattering dishes, had gone eerily silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and made every creak of old wood sound like a warning. She thought of leaving. She thought of it seriously, standing there with her coat already half-buttoned, her small bag of belongings packed by the servants' entrance. She had no obligation to stay. She had no family ties to the Whitmores, no promises made, no debt owed. She was simply a housemaid, paid to clean and serve, and nothing in her contract required her to nurse a dying man that his own family had abandoned. But then she thought of the conversation she had overheard, the calm cruelty in Edmund's voice, the businesslike tone in Margaret's questions about documents and transfers. She thought of Alistair Whitmore lying alone in that enormous bed upstairs, fighting for breath with no one beside him, betrayed by the very people who should have loved him most. She unbuttoned her coat and set her bag back down. Whatever waited for her in the coming days, whatever danger or difficulty, she would not let this man die alone and forgotten in his own home. She climbed the staircase slowly, candle in hand, and made her way back to his chamber, where the Duke lay pale and still beneath heavy blankets, his breathing so faint she had to lean close just to be certain he still lived. She pulled a chair beside his bed, the same chair she had sat in the night before, and settled in for what she suspected would be a very long and uncertain road ahead. "You are not alone," she whispered, though she knew he could not hear her. "Not while I am here." Outside, the wind picked up against the old windows, rattling the glass as though the manor itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The candle burned low by the 3rd night, and still the Duke had not opened his eyes. Eliza had barely slept. She measured her hours by the dripping wax and the shifting shadows on the wall, refusing to leave his side except for brief trips to the kitchen to boil water or fetch fresh cloths. The manor around her had grown even quieter, if such a thing were possible, as though the walls themselves understood that something was deeply wrong within them. On the fourth morning, she discovered the letters. She had gone into the study to search for medical texts, anything that might explain the Duke's strange symptoms, when she noticed a drawer in his writing desk left slightly open. Curiosity, or perhaps instinct, made her pull it further. Inside lay a stack of papers bound with string, correspondence between Edmund and a man named Victor Cole, a solicitor whose name she did not recognize. She knew she should not read another family's private letters. She had been raised to respect boundaries, to keep her eyes and hands away from matters that did not concern her station. But the memory of the conversation she had overheard through the linen closet wall pushed aside every hesitation. She untied the string with trembling fingers. The first letter, dated nearly 3 months earlier, discussed adjustments to the family trust. Nothing unusual on its surface, the kind of dry legal language she barely understood. But the second letter made her stomach twist. Victor Cole had written to Edmund confirming that, in the event of the Duke's incapacity or death, control of the estate accounts would transfer not to Charles, the rightful heir by tradition, but directly to Edmund himself, structured through a clause buried deep within an amended will. The letter referenced a signature obtained during what it called a period of confusion, though it did not specify whose confusion, or how it had been arranged. Eliza read the passage 3 times, before the meaning fully settled into her. The will had been changed, recently, and not through the Duke's clear and willing hand, if the wording was to be believed. She continued through the stack, finding a third letter that chilled her even more deeply. It referenced a substance, described only by a code name, delivered to the estate weeks before the Duke's collapse, along with instructions for its use, that Eliza could barely bring herself to finish reading. The letter spoke of dosage and timing, with the same detached precision a physician might use when discussing medicine, except this described something meant to harm, not heal. She folded the letters carefully, her hands shaking, and hid them inside the lining of her apron, before returning to the Duke's chamber. Whatever these papers proved, she could not carry them alone, but she also could not risk anyone else discovering that she knew. That evening, as she changed the cloth on the Duke's forehead, she noticed his fingers twitch. A small movement, barely perceptible, but enough to make her freeze in place. "Your Grace?" she whispered. His eyelids fluttered, opening halfway, before closing again, his breath catching in his throat. Encouraged, Eliza pressed a cup of water gently to his lips, tilting it just enough for a few drops to pass. He swallowed weakly, a reflex more than a conscious act, but it was something. It was the first sign of life she had seen since the collapse. Over the following days, she dedicated herself entirely to his care, following every instruction Dr. Pell had left behind, and supplementing it with knowledge she gathered from an old healer in the nearby village, a woman named Agnes Miller, who had treated fevers and strange illnesses for decades. Eliza walked the 3 miles to the village and back each day, careful never to be gone too long, fearful of what might happen if she left the Duke unattended even for a few hours. Agnes listened carefully, as Eliza described the symptoms, the sudden collapse, the trembling, the froth at the mouth, the slow and uneven pulse. The old woman's face grew serious as she listened, and she disappeared into her small cottage, returning with a collection of dried herbs, and a warning delivered in a low, careful voice. "This is not natural illness, child. Someone gave him something, and gave it slowly, over time, so no single moment would seem alarming enough to raise suspicion. It is a cruel way to harm a person. Whoever did this wanted it to look like nature simply taking its course." Eliza's throat tightened. "Can he recover?" Agnes studied her for a long moment before answering. "If the poisoning has stopped, and if his body is strong enough, there is a chance. But he will need constant care, patience, and someone willing to fight for him when he cannot fight for himself. Are you prepared for that, child?" Eliza did not hesitate. Yes. She returned to the manor with the herbs bundled carefully in cloth, along with detailed instructions for teas and compresses that Agnes promised would help draw the remaining poison from his system and strengthen his weakened body. Eliza followed every step precisely, preparing the bitter tea each morning and evening, applying warm compresses to his chest to ease his breathing, and speaking to him constantly, believing somewhere deep down that even in his unconscious state, he could hear her voice and draw comfort from it. On the 7th night since his collapse, a violent storm rolled over the estate, rain hammering against the windows and thunder shaking the old stone walls. Eliza sat beside the Duke's bed, exhausted beyond measure, her eyes burning from lack of sleep, when his hand suddenly gripped hers with surprising strength. She gasped, nearly dropping the cloth in her other hand. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, searching the darkness of the room before settling on her face. His lips moved, but no sound came out. She leaned closer, straining to hear. "Who?" he managed finally, his voice a dry, broken whisper. "Are you?" "Eliza," she said softly. "Eliza Hartwell. I work in your household, Your Grace. You collapsed at your birthday dinner. You have been very ill." Confusion clouded his eyes. "Margaret? Charles? Where?" "They are in the city," Eliza said carefully, unwilling to reveal the full truth so suddenly to a man barely clinging to consciousness. There were matters requiring their attention. His grip on her hand tightened, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face that looked very much like understanding, and beneath it, something far more painful. He did not ask further questions that night. His strength gave out quickly, and he slipped back into a deep sleep, though his breathing seemed steadier than before. His color slightly improved. Eliza did not sleep at all that night. She sat holding his hand long after he had drifted off, her mind racing through everything she had learned, the letters hidden in her apron, the poison Agnes had described, the calm cruelty of a family who had already begun dividing what they believed would soon be theirs. She knew that when the Duke grew strong enough to understand fully, the truth would shatter him in ways his illness never could. But she also knew that hiding it from him would only delay an inevitable and necessary reckoning. Over the following 2 weeks, his strength slowly returned. He woke for longer periods each day, managed to sit upright with assistance, and eventually began taking solid food, though his body remained weak and his memory of recent events fragmented and unreliable. Eliza cared for him tirelessly, bathing his wounds, changing his linens, preparing his meals, and reading to him in the evenings, when his mind grew restless and sleep would not come easily. During one such evening, as rain once again tapped gently against the windows, Alistair studied her closely from his propped pillows, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. "You have stayed this entire time," he said quietly. "Alone." "Yes, Your Grace." "Why?" Eliza considered her answer carefully, unwilling yet to reveal everything she knew. "Because someone needed to." He was silent for a long moment, studying her face, as though searching for something hidden beneath her simple answer. "Where is everyone else? My family? My staff?" "The staff left, one by one," she said honestly. "Your family relocated to the city shortly after your collapse." His expression did not change immediately, but something behind his eyes seemed to dim, a slow, quiet devastation settling over features already worn thin by illness. "And they simply left me here." Eliza did not answer, because there was no answer that would soften the truth, and she refused to lie to him about something this important. He turned his face toward the window, watching the rain trace patterns down the glass, and said nothing further for a long while. "I remember bits and pieces," he finally said, his voice distant. "Voices, arguing, perhaps, or planning. I cannot be certain what was real, and what my fevered mind invented." Eliza's fingers brushed against the hidden letters beneath her apron, still folded and waiting. She was not ready to show him yet, not while his body remained so fragile, his heart already burdened with the pain of abandonment. But she understood, with growing certainty, that the truth would need to surface soon, before those responsible returned to finish what they had started. "Rest now, Your Grace," she said gently, rising to dim the remaining candle. "There will be time enough for difficult conversations when you are stronger." He nodded slowly, his eyes already growing heavy with the pull of exhausted sleep. As she moved toward the door, his voice stopped her one final time. "Eliza." She turned back. "Thank you, for staying when no one else would." She offered him a small, tired smile, though her heart ached with everything she had not yet told him. "Sleep well, Your Grace. Tomorrow is another day, and you are still here to see it." She closed the door softly behind her, leaving him to rest, while outside the storm continued its steady rhythm against the ancient stone walls of a manor that held far more secrets than either of them, yet fully understood. A carriage appeared at the end of the long gravel drive without warning, its wheels crunching against stone in the early morning fog, and Eliza's heart lurched with immediate alarm. She had been carrying a tray of broth to the Duke's chamber when she spotted it through the tall front window, and she nearly dropped the tray entirely. It was too soon. The Duke had only regained his strength enough to walk a few unsteady steps around his room, leaning heavily on her arm. He was not ready to face his family, not with the truth still unspoken between them. She set the tray down quickly and rushed to the window, watching as the carriage rolled to a stop and a single figure stepped out. Relief flooded through her when she recognized not Edmund or Margaret, but a stranger, a tall man in a dark traveling coat carrying a leather satchel. She met him at the door before he could knock. "I am looking for Duke Alistair Whitmore," the man said, removing his hat politely. "My name is Peter Grant. I am a solicitor. I received a letter some weeks ago, requesting my services regarding a matter of significant urgency, but the correspondence was interrupted before details could be finalized. I have come to see if the matter still requires attention." Eliza studied him carefully, uncertain whether to trust a stranger arriving so suddenly at the estate's darkest hour. "Who sent for you, if I may ask?" Peter Grant hesitated, his brow furrowing. The letter was signed by the Duke himself, though it arrived in a hand shakier than I would have expected from his previous correspondence. It mentioned concerns about his family's handling of estate matters and requested a review of recent legal documents. I assumed, given the urgency of the tone, that I should come in person rather than wait for further instruction. Eliza's breath caught. The Duke had sensed something wrong before his collapse. He had reached out for help even as his own body began failing him, likely during the earliest stages of whatever poison had been slipped into his system, before his mind grew too clouded to act. "Please, come inside," she said. "The Duke is recovering from a serious illness, but I believe he will want to speak with you." She led Peter Grant through the quiet halls of the manor, explaining briefly along the way the events of recent weeks, the sudden collapse, the family's abrupt departure, the skeleton staff that had dwindled to nothing. Peter listened with growing concern, his expression darkening further with each detail she shared. They found the Duke sitting upright in a chair near the window, a blanket draped over his lap, his face pale but alert. He turned as they entered, and recognition flickered across his features when he saw the solicitor. "Peter Grant," he said slowly, his voice still weak but steadier than before. "I did not expect you to actually come." "Your Grace," Peter said, bowing slightly, before taking the seat Eliza offered him. "I confess, I nearly did not. Your letter arrived weeks ago, and when no follow-up came, I assumed the matter had resolved itself, or perhaps was no longer urgent. It was only recent troubling rumors from the city, whispers among certain circles regarding changes to your estate's management, that convinced me to investigate personally." Alistair's eyes sharpened, despite his exhaustion. "What rumors?" Peter glanced briefly at Eliza before continuing, as though uncertain how much to reveal in front of a housemaid. Alistair noticed the hesitation immediately. "Speak freely," he said. "Eliza has earned more trust in these past weeks than my own blood relations. Whatever you say to me, you may say in front of her." Peter nodded, drawing a folder from his satchel. "There have been discussions among certain financial circles in the city regarding transfers of authority over your estate accounts, discussions that reference documentation suggesting incapacity on your part. I found this troubling, given that no formal declaration of incapacity had been filed through proper legal channels, at least none that I had been made aware of." Alistair's jaw tightened. "Show me." As Peter began laying out documents on the small table beside the window, Eliza retrieved the letters she had hidden weeks earlier, the ones she had found in the study drawer, the correspondence between Edmund and Victor Cole. She had waited for the right moment to reveal them, uncertain when the Duke would be strong enough to bear such devastating proof of betrayal. This moment, with a solicitor present to help interpret the legal implications, seemed as right as any. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "there is something you should see as well." She handed him the bundled letters, watching his face carefully as he untied the string and began reading. Peter leaned over to read alongside him, and the two men fell into a heavy, tense silence broken only by the rustle of pages and the occasional sharp intake of breath. When Alistair finished the final letter, his hands were trembling, though not from illness this time. "This cannot be real," he whispered, though his voice carried no genuine doubt, only devastated hope that he might be wrong. "Edmund. My own brother." Peter Grant examined the letters again, his expression grim. "Your Grace, if these documents are authentic, and I have no reason to doubt they are, This describes not only fraudulent alteration of your will, but potentially something far more serious. The reference to a substance delivered weeks before your collapse, described with such specific attention to dosage and timing, this reads very much like a description of deliberate harm. Alistair closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. I remember so little of that night. Flashes only. The taste of the wine seemed strange, slightly bitter, though I dismissed it as nerves before my toast. And afterward, nothing but darkness and fragmented dreams. Do you recall anything else? Peter asked gently. Any detail, however small, might prove significant. Alistair's brow furrowed in concentration, his mind straining against the fog that still clouded portions of his memory. There were voices, once, during those early days of fever. I could not distinguish words clearly, only tones, calm, businesslike. It disturbed me greatly, though I could not explain why at the time. Eliza's stomach tightened as she recalled the conversation she had overheard through the linen closet wall, the discussion of documents and transfers, Edmund's cold assurance that the Duke would not recover. She had not yet told Alistair about that conversation directly, unwilling to burden him with every painful detail while his body remained fragile. But now, with Peter Grant present and formal proof already laid before them, the time for full honesty had arrived. Your Grace, she said carefully, there is more you should know. She recounted the conversation in full, every word she remembered from that first terrible night. Edmund's calm assurance that the Duke would not survive, Margaret's businesslike questions about documents and transfers, Charles's hesitant question about what might happen if his father woke, and Edmund's chilling response. Alistair listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each detail, though his eyes remained fixed and clear, absorbing every word with the focus of a man determined to understand the full shape of his betrayal. They did not simply abandon me, Alistair said finally, his voice hollow. They planned this, all of them. My wife, my children, my own brother. Peter Grant cleared his throat gently. Your Grace, I understand this is devastating news, but we must move quickly if we hope to address the legal aspects of this situation before further damage is done. The forged will, if we can prove its illegitimacy, would need to be formally challenged through proper channels. And regarding the matter of the substance described in these letters, that is a matter that may extend beyond civil law entirely, into far more serious territory. Alistair sat in silence, staring down at his trembling hands. Eliza moved closer, kneeling beside his chair, placing a steadying hand over his. You are not alone in this, she said softly. Whatever comes next, you do not face it by yourself. He looked at her then, with an expression she had not seen from him before, something raw and unguarded, gratitude mixed with grief, mixed with a flicker of something else entirely, something neither of them was yet ready to name. No, he said quietly. It seems I am not. Peter Grant, sensing the weight of the moment, busied himself gathering his documents, giving the two of them a measure of privacy within the quiet room. Your Grace, with your permission, I would like to begin drafting a formal challenge to the amended will immediately. I will also discreetly reach out to contacts within the city, who may have further information regarding your family's recent activities. The more evidence we gather, the stronger our position when the time comes to confront them. Do it, Alistair said, his voice gaining a firmness that had been absent since his collapse. Whatever it takes. Peter nodded and rose to leave, promising to return within the week with further documentation and legal recommendations. Eliza walked him to the door, and as he stepped back into his waiting carriage, he paused and turned to her with an expression of quiet respect. You have shown remarkable courage, Miss Hartwell. Not many would have stayed, given the circumstances. Fewer still would have pursued the truth as diligently as you have. He deserved someone in his corner, Eliza said simply. That is all I have done. Peter offered a small, knowing smile before climbing into his carriage and disappearing back down the long gravel drive, leaving Eliza standing alone at the entrance, the cold morning air biting against her skin as she watched the fog swallow the retreating wheels. She returned inside to find Alistair still seated by the window, staring out at the gray winter landscape stretching beyond the estate grounds, his expression distant and troubled. Your Grace, she said gently, you should rest. This has been a difficult morning. How can I rest? He murmured, knowing what I now know. My own brother sought to end my life for the sake of inheritance. My wife discussed my death as though arranging a business transaction. My children stood by and said nothing to stop it. Eliza had no words that could soften such devastating truths, so instead, she simply remained beside him, offering quiet company, rather than empty comfort. After a long while, he finally spoke again, his voice steadier, though something hardened had settled behind his eyes. They believed they had already won, he said. They believed I was finished, and the estate was theirs to divide as they pleased. They did not count on you. I only did what any decent person would do, Eliza said. No, Alistair said firmly, turning to look at her directly. You did far more than that. You stayed when everyone else abandoned me. You searched for answers when it would have been far easier to look away. You brought help when you could have simply waited for the inevitable, as they did. That is not merely decency, Eliza. That is courage, of a kind I have rarely witnessed in my life, certainly never from those who claim to love me. Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks, unaccustomed to such direct and heartfelt praise from a man of his standing. I only wanted to see justice done, Your Grace, nothing more. Perhaps, he said quietly, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. But I suspect there is more to you than even you realize, Eliza Hartwell. Outside, the winter wind picked up once more, rattling against the old windows, while inside the manor, a quiet transformation had begun, one built not on titles or bloodlines, but on loyalty freely given, and courage that asked for nothing in return. Whatever battles lay ahead, whatever reckoning awaited the family who had so callously abandoned him, Alistair Whitmore understood now that he did not face it alone, and that understanding alone gave him strength he had not felt in weeks. A messenger arrived at the manor gates just after dusk, breathless and urgent, carrying news that made Eliza's blood run cold. They know, the young messenger said, catching his breath after the long ride from the city. Someone in the solicitor's office spoke carelessly, and word has reached the Whitmore townhouse that the Duke survived his illness. I came as quickly as I could to warn you. Eliza thanked the messenger and sent him to the kitchen for food and rest, her mind already racing with the implications. If Edmund and Margaret knew that Alistair had survived, and worse, that a solicitor was actively investigating the forged will, they would not simply wait patiently for a confrontation. They would act, and likely soon. She hurried upstairs to find Alistair sitting at his writing desk, stronger now than he had been in weeks, though still requiring rest each afternoon to preserve his recovering strength. He looked up as she entered, immediately reading the concern etched across her face. What has happened? She relayed the messenger's warning, watching him carefully as his expression shifted from calm concentration to sharp alertness. He set down his pen and rose from the desk, moving toward the window that overlooked the long gravel drive, as though half expecting to see carriages already approaching. They will not come quietly, he said. If they believe their plans are unraveling, they will attempt to control the situation however they can, whether through further deception or something more direct. Eliza's stomach tightened at the implication. Do you believe they would try to harm you again? Alistair was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. I do not know what my brother is capable of anymore. I thought I knew him once. I was wrong. That evening, Peter Grant returned to the manor earlier than expected, his expression grave as he stepped down from his carriage. He carried with him a thick folder of documents, along with news that confirmed their worst fears. I have spoken with several contacts in the city, he explained, settling into the study alongside Alistair and Eliza. The rumors have grown significantly. It appears Edmund has been quietly transferring funds from the estate accounts over the past several days, likely in anticipation of losing access entirely once formal legal challenges are filed. He has also, according to one reliable source, engaged additional legal counsel of his own, presumably to contest whatever claims we intend to bring forward. Then he intends to fight this, Alistair said grimly. It appears so, Peter confirmed, which means we must move with great care and greater speed. I have drafted formal documentation, challenging the amended will, citing irregularities in its execution, and witness testimony. However, proving fraudulent intent, let alone anything more serious regarding your collapse, will require substantially stronger evidence than we currently possess. Eliza spoke up, her voice steady, despite the tension gripping the room. What of Dr. Pell? He suspected poisoning from the very beginning. Might his professional testimony carry weight in such matters? Peter considered this thoughtfully. It could indeed prove valuable, provided he is willing to formally document his suspicions and testify if required. Physicians are often reluctant to make such serious accusations without concrete proof, given the professional risks involved. But if he genuinely believed poisoning to be the likely cause, his testimony would lend significant credibility to our case. Tomorrow, if my strength allows it. Eliza glanced at him with concern. Your Grace, you have only recently begun regaining your strength. A journey into town, even a short one, may prove taxing. I have spent enough time lying helpless while others determined my fate, Alistair replied, his tone resolute. I will not remain a passive spectator in the fight for my own life and legacy any longer. The following morning, despite lingering weakness, Alistair insisted on traveling into the nearby town, accompanied by Eliza and Peter Grant. The carriage ride proved exhausting for him, his energy flagging noticeably by the time they arrived at Dr. Pell's modest practice. But his determination never wavered. Dr. Pell greeted them with visible surprise, clearly astonished to see the Duke alive and mobile after weeks of presumed decline. Once seated in the doctor's small consultation room, Alistair wasted no time addressing the matter directly. Doctor, I understand you suspected poisoning at the time of my collapse. I need to know if you would be willing to formally document that suspicion and testify to it if legal proceedings require. Dr. Pell's expression grew serious, his eyes flicking briefly toward the window as though considering the potential consequences of such a declaration. Your Grace, I did indeed suspect poisoning, based on the specific symptoms I observed that evening. However, making such an accusation formally carries significant weight, particularly against a family of your standing. I would need to be entirely certain before committing such testimony to official record. I understand the risk to your reputation, Alistair said, but I assure you, the risk to my life, and the injustice already done to me, far outweighs any professional discomfort you may feel. Dr. Pell studied the Duke for a long moment before finally nodding slowly. Very well. I will document my observations in full detail, including the specific symptoms I witnessed, and my professional assessment that they align closely with certain known poisoning agents rather than natural illness. I cannot identify the specific substance without further investigation, but I can attest that natural illness alone does not adequately explain what I observed. Relief flooded through Eliza at the doctor's willingness to help, though she understood this represented only one piece of the larger puzzle they needed to assemble. As they prepared to leave the consultation room, Dr. Pell added one final piece of information that made the entire group pause. There is something else you should know, he said. Shortly after your collapse, someone visited my practice, inquiring about the tincture I had prescribed for your fever. They claimed to be gathering information on your behalf, to better understand your treatment, but something about their questions struck me as unusual at the time. They seemed far more interested in whether the tincture might mask or interfere with certain other substances than in your actual recovery. Who was this person? Peter asked sharply. Dr. Pell hesitated. I did not catch a name, but I recall the visitor was a young man, well-dressed, speaking with the confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them. Given what you have now shared with me, I suspect it may have been connected to your son, your Grace, though I cannot say with absolute certainty. Alistair's face hardened at this new revelation, the weight of his son's potential involvement settling heavily upon him. Eliza reached out instinctively, placing a steadying hand on his arm, and he seemed to draw strength from the simple gesture, his shoulders straightening despite the painful implications of what he had just learned. Thank you, Doctor, he said finally. Your honesty means a great deal, more than you likely realize. They departed shortly after, the carriage ride back to the manor, passing in heavy, contemplative silence. Alistair stared out the window at the passing countryside, his expression distant, clearly wrestling with the growing evidence of betrayal, extending even to his own children. Charles, he murmured eventually, almost to himself. I raised him to value honor above all else. I taught him that a man's word and a man's actions define his character far more than his title or his wealth. How did I fail so completely to see what he had become? You did not fail him, Your Grace, Eliza said gently. People make their own choices, regardless of how they were raised. His actions belonged to him alone, not to any shortcoming on your part. Alistair turned to look at her, something softening in his expression despite the weight of grief still pressing upon him. You continue to offer me comfort I have no right to expect, given your position within my household. Perhaps, Eliza replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Comfort should not depend on position at all, but simply on what is right. He held her gaze a moment longer than propriety typically allowed, something unspoken passing between them, before finally looking away toward the passing landscape once more. Back at the manor that evening, Peter Grant worked late into the night, compiling the growing body of evidence: Dr. Pell's written statement, the intercepted letters between Edmund and Victor Cole, and detailed notes regarding the suspicious inquiries made following the Duke's collapse. Eliza assisted where she could, organizing documents and preparing food to sustain the men through their long hours of work, though her mind remained troubled by the messenger's earlier warning. If the family already suspected that their plans were unraveling, how long would they wait before attempting something more drastic to protect themselves? Her question was answered sooner than she expected. Just past midnight, as she made her way toward the kitchen to prepare fresh tea for Peter and the Duke, she noticed movement outside near the stables, a shadow shifting briefly against the moonlit grounds, before disappearing behind the old carriage house. Her pulse quickened immediately, every instinct urging caution. She hurried back inside and alerted Alistair and Peter, who exchanged grim glances before Peter retrieved a lantern and a walking stick from beside the study door, the closest thing to a weapon readily available within the manor. Stay here, Alistair instructed Eliza firmly. Whatever this is, I will not risk your safety further. With respect, Your Grace, Eliza replied, already reaching for a heavy fireplace poker resting nearby. I have not survived these past weeks by remaining passively behind, while others face danger on my behalf. Alistair opened his mouth to argue further, but something in Eliza's resolute expression convinced him the debate would prove futile. Together, the three of them moved cautiously toward the stables, the cold night air biting sharply against their skin as they approached the shadowed carriage house, where the mysterious figure had disappeared. Inside, they found nothing but empty stalls and scattered hay, the horses restless but unharmed. Whatever, or whoever, had been lurking near the grounds had vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only unsettling questions and a growing sense that their enemies were closer than they had realized. A scout, perhaps, Peter suggested quietly as they made their way back toward the manor, sent to assess the situation before any further action is taken. Alistair's expression darkened further at the suggestion. Then we must assume our time is limited. Whatever we intend to do, we must act swiftly, before Edmund decides that quiet manipulation is no longer sufficient to secure what he believes belongs to him. They returned to the study, the earlier sense of urgency now sharpened into something far more immediate and dangerous. Eliza glanced toward the window one final time before settling back into her work, watching the dark silhouette of the stables against the moonlit grounds, wondering just how much time truly remained before the fragile peace they had built together would be shattered entirely by the family determined to destroy them. The bank clerk's hands trembled as he slid the ledger across the counter toward Peter Grant, glancing nervously toward the door, as though fearing someone might witness the exchange. I should not be showing you this, the clerk whispered. If Master Edmund discovers what I have done, I will lose my position, perhaps face far worse consequences. Your name will not appear anywhere in our documentation, Peter assured him quietly. You have my word as a solicitor bound by professional ethics. The clerk nodded reluctantly, though his anxiety remained visible as Peter began examining the pages before him. Eliza stood nearby, watching the exchange with quiet intensity, while Alistair remained seated in the carriage outside, his continued recovery still too fragile for extended visits into town, though his impatience to be directly involved in every step of the investigation had grown considerably. The ledger revealed exactly what they had suspected. Over the course of several weeks following the Duke's collapse, Edmund had systematically transferred substantial sums from the estate's primary accounts into a series of smaller accounts scattered across different banks throughout the city, each transfer carefully structured to avoid drawing immediate attention. The pattern was unmistakable, deliberate, and thoroughly damning. This alone proves premeditation, Peter murmured, copying the relevant figures into his own notes. No innocent explanation accounts for such carefully disguised movement of funds, particularly during a period when the account holder was believed to be near death. They thanked the clerk and departed quickly, returning to the waiting carriage where Alistair sat wrapped in a heavy coat against the winter chill. He studied their expressions carefully as they climbed inside, immediately sensing the significance of what they had discovered. "Well?" he asked. Peter handed over his notes, watching as the Duke's face grew increasingly grim while reviewing the figures. "Your brother has been quite thorough in his preparations, Your Grace. This level of careful, deliberate financial maneuvering does not happen by accident or panic. It suggests long-term planning, likely beginning well before your collapse." Alistair closed his eyes briefly, absorbing yet another layer of betrayal atop the ones already weighing upon him. "How long, do you suppose? How long has my own brother been planning to end my life for the sake of inheritance?" "That, Your Grace, is a question only Edmund himself can answer truthfully," Peter said. "Though I suspect the true answer would prove far more painful than even our current suspicions suggest." Over the following days, the investigation continued to deepen, each new discovery adding weight to the case being built against Edmund, and, by extension, Margaret and Charles as well. Peter's contacts within the city uncovered evidence that Victor Cole, the solicitor who had corresponded with Edmund regarding the amended will, had a history of questionable legal practices, including at least 2 previous instances where he had assisted wealthy families in circumventing proper inheritance procedures through carefully manufactured documentation. More disturbingly, further investigation revealed that the substance referenced obliquely in the letters between Edmund and Victor Cole matched the profile of a slow-acting compound known among certain unsavory circles for producing symptoms nearly indistinguishable from natural illness when administered gradually over an extended period. Dr. Pell, upon reviewing this new information alongside his own earlier observations, grew increasingly confident in his willingness to testify formally regarding his professional suspicions. Eliza spent her days assisting Peter with organizing the growing mountain of evidence, while continuing to care for Alistair's ongoing recovery, though she noticed with quiet satisfaction that his strength returned more each day, his color improving, his voice growing steadier and more resolute with each passing week. The physical toll of his illness slowly gave way to something else entirely, a hardened determination that had not existed within him before, forged through the painful process of confronting his family's betrayal directly, rather than remaining a passive victim of circumstances beyond his control. One evening, as Eliza helped him settle into a chair near the fireplace, following a particularly exhausting day of reviewing legal documents with Peter, Alistair studied her with an expression she had grown increasingly familiar with over recent weeks, something warm and searching beneath his typically composed exterior. "May I ask you something personal, Eliza?" "Of course, Your Grace. Why did you truly stay? I understand your explanation regarding decency and doing what felt right, but surely there were easier paths available to you. You could have left with the other staff, sought employment elsewhere, avoided entirely the danger and difficulty that has now become part of your daily life. Why choose this path instead?" Eliza considered the question carefully, recognizing that he deserved an honest answer rather than a simple deflection. "I have spent much of my life watching from the edges of rooms, Your Grace, invisible in the way that servants often are to those they serve. I have witnessed countless moments of cruelty and indifference that others never noticed because they never thought to look. When you collapsed that night, and your family responded with nothing but calculated calm, I saw clearly what kind of people they truly were beneath their polished exteriors. I could not simply walk away and pretend I had not witnessed such profound betrayal. That still does not fully explain why you personally chose to risk everything remaining here," Alistair pressed gently. Eliza met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps, Your Grace, I simply could not accept the idea of any person being left entirely alone to face death, regardless of their title or station. Perhaps I recognized something worth fighting for in you, even before I fully understood the depth of what your family had done." Something shifted in Alistair's expression, warmth and gratitude mixing with an emotion far more complicated, that neither of them yet dared to name openly. "You have given me more than mere care during these difficult weeks, Eliza. You have restored something within me I feared had been lost entirely, a belief that genuine loyalty and kindness still exist in this world, even when those closest to us prove capable of the deepest betrayal." Eliza felt her cheeks warm under the weight of his sincere words, though she quickly redirected the conversation, uncertain how to navigate the growing tension of feelings neither of them had explicitly acknowledged. "We should focus on the matters at hand, Your Grace. Peter mentioned he intends to file the formal legal challenge within the coming days, provided we can gather sufficient additional evidence. Alistair allowed the subject change, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer before he nodded in agreement. Yes, of course, there is still much work ahead of us. 2 days later, Peter arrived at the manor with news that shifted the entire trajectory of their investigation. A former employee of Victor Cole's law office, dismissed several months earlier under circumstances she described as deeply troubling, had come forward, willing to provide sworn testimony regarding practices she had witnessed within the firm, including direct knowledge of documents being altered and witness signatures being falsified for wealthy clients seeking to circumvent legitimate inheritance procedures. Her name was Margaret Doyle, and she agreed to meet with Peter and Alistair personally to provide her account in full detail. They met her at a small inn on the outskirts of the city, chosen deliberately for its distance from prying eyes that might recognize either the Duke or his solicitor. Margaret Doyle proved to be a sharp, observant woman whose testimony, once given, painted an even more damning picture than they had previously assembled. "I witnessed the document myself," she explained, her voice steady despite the visible nervousness in her hands. "The amended will bearing the Duke's signature. I was present when Victor Cole instructed a clerk to practice replicating a signature from an older, legitimate document, claiming it was merely for administrative purposes. It was only weeks later, after my dismissal, that I began to understand the true purpose behind that practice." "Would you be willing to provide this testimony formally, before proper legal authorities?" Peter asked carefully. Margaret Doyle hesitated only briefly, before nodding firmly. "Victor Cole dismissed me without cause, and without compensation, after I raised concerns about certain practices within his office. I owe him nothing but the consequences of his own actions. Yes, I will testify." With Margaret Doyle's testimony added to their growing collection of evidence, Alistair and Peter finally possessed what they believed constituted sufficient grounds to formally challenge the amended will and expose the broader conspiracy surrounding his collapse. Yet, even as their case grew stronger, Alistair remained troubled by one persistent question that continued to gnaw at him throughout the long carriage ride back to the manor. "What of Charles?" he asked quietly, staring out at the darkening countryside. "And Louisa? Were they merely complicit bystanders, or active participants in what Edmund orchestrated? I find myself desperately hoping for the former, even as growing evidence suggests otherwise." Peter considered his response carefully before answering. "Your Grace, based on everything we have gathered thus far, the clearest evidence of direct involvement points toward Edmund, and, to a lesser extent, Margaret, regarding the will's alteration and subsequent financial transfers. Charles's involvement remains less definitively proven, though Dr. Pell's account of the suspicious visitor inquiring about tinctures and potential interactions with other substances certainly raises troubling questions." "And Louisa?" Alistair pressed. "My daughter has said remarkably little throughout every account you have gathered. Perhaps her silence speaks its own truth," Eliza offered quietly from beside him. "Whether from complicity or simple cowardice, choosing not to intervene when intervention was so clearly needed carries its own weight of responsibility." Alistair fell silent, absorbing this painful reality alongside everything else he had learned over recent weeks. The carriage continued its journey back toward the manor, beneath a darkening winter sky, carrying within it not only the physical evidence of betrayal now carefully documented and prepared, but also the accumulated emotional weight of a man forced to confront the devastating truth that those who should have loved him most had instead calculated his death as merely a convenient step toward their own ambitions. As the manor finally came into view, its familiar silhouette rising against the darkening horizon, Alistair reached over and took Eliza's hand in his own, a simple gesture that carried far more meaning than either of them openly acknowledged in that quiet, contemplative moment. "Whatever happens when this reckoning finally arrives," he said softly, "know that your courage these past weeks has meant more to me than I can adequately express in words." Eliza squeezed his hand gently in return, saying nothing further, though the warmth of that simple connection carried them both through the remaining silence of their journey home, toward whatever confrontation still awaited them in the days to come. Smoke curled from the chimney of the old gatehouse when Eliza spotted it just before dawn, and something about the timing sent an immediate chill through her body. No one used the gatehouse anymore. It had stood empty for years, a relic from an earlier generation of Whitmores, who once employed a full-time gatekeeper. Yet there it was, unmistakable smoke rising against the pale morning sky. Evidence that someone had taken up residence there recently, quietly, without announcement. She woke Alistair immediately, and together with Peter Grant, who had taken to staying at the manor several nights each week as their legal preparations intensified, they approached the gatehouse cautiously, armed with little more than a lantern and growing suspicion. Inside, they found evidence of recent habitation, a small fire still smoldering in the hearth, blankets arranged near the window facing the manor's main entrance, and most alarming of all, a spyglass positioned carefully on the windowsill, angled directly toward the front doors of the estate. "Someone has been watching us," Alistair said grimly, examining the spyglass with a troubled expression, "watching every visitor who arrives, every carriage that departs." Peter crouched beside the cold ashes of a small fire pit outside, examining scattered fragments of paper that had not fully burned. He carefully extracted the largest remaining piece and studied it under the lantern's dim light. "This appears to be correspondence," he said slowly, "though most of it has been destroyed. I can make out only a few words, but one phrase remains legible enough to concern me greatly." He held the fragment toward Alistair, who leaned close to read the partially burned text. His face hardened as he made out the words scrawled in a hand he recognized instantly. "This is Edmund's handwriting," he said quietly. The remaining words reference timing, and something about ensuring matters are concluded before formal proceedings begin. Eliza felt her stomach tighten with dread. "They intend to act before your legal challenge can be filed." "It would seem so," Peter agreed grimly. "Whoever has been staying here has likely been reporting our movements directly back to Edmund, providing him with detailed knowledge of our progress and preparations." They returned to the manor immediately, and Alistair called an emergency meeting with Peter that same morning, recognizing that whatever advantage of time they believed they possessed had likely evaporated entirely. If Edmund understood the full scope of evidence being assembled against him, he would not simply wait passively for legal proceedings to unfold in their natural course. "We must file the challenge today," Alistair said firmly, pacing the length of his study, despite lingering weakness that still occasionally troubled his movements. "Whatever risk exists in moving too quickly pales beside the risk of allowing Edmund additional time to act." Peter nodded in agreement, already gathering the mountain of documentation they had assembled over recent weeks. "I will travel to the city magistrate's office immediately and file the formal challenge, along with Dr. Pell's written statement and Margaret Doyle's sworn testimony. Once filed, the matter becomes public record, difficult for Edmund to simply ignore or suppress." "And the financial records?" Alistair asked. "The evidence of transferred funds?" "Included as well," Peter confirmed, along with formal requests for immediate audit of the estate accounts, which should, at minimum, freeze further movement of funds while the investigation proceeds. As Peter prepared to depart for the city, Eliza pulled Alistair aside privately, her expression troubled by concerns she had not yet voiced aloud. "Your Grace, once this challenge becomes public, Edmund will know beyond any doubt that we possess substantial evidence against him. What if he decides that legal consequences matter less to him than simply ensuring you never live to see this reckoning through?" Alistair's expression grew serious as he considered her words carefully. "You believe he might attempt something more direct?" "I believe a man capable of poisoning his own brother for inheritance is capable of far worse when he realizes that inheritance slipping entirely from his grasp," Eliza said honestly. Alistair was silent for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "Then we must ensure the estate is properly secured. I will speak with the few remaining staff about increased vigilance, and perhaps it would be wise to arrange for additional protection until this matter reaches its conclusion." Over the following days, as Peter navigated the formal legal proceedings in the city, tension within the manor grew increasingly palpable. Alistair arranged for 2 trusted men from the nearby village, former soldiers known for their reliability, to maintain watch over the estate grounds during the evening hours. Eliza found herself constantly alert, checking windows and doors more frequently than strictly necessary, her nerves stretched thin by the persistent awareness that danger might arrive at any moment. Despite the mounting tension, Alistair's physical recovery continued steadily, his strength returning to levels that finally allowed him to move freely throughout the manor, without exhaustion overtaking him after only brief exertion. The transformation extended beyond mere physical healing as well. The man Eliza had first discovered collapsed on the dining room floor, and later the fragile, confused figure barely clinging to consciousness in his sickbed had gradually given way to someone far more resolute and clear-eyed, forged through weeks of confronting painful truths about those he had once trusted completely. One quiet evening, as they sat together in the study, reviewing the latest updates from Peter regarding the legal proceedings, Alistair set down the papers he had been examining and studied Eliza with an expression of quiet contemplation. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about what comes after this ordeal finally concludes, whatever form that conclusion ultimately takes. What have you been thinking, Your Grace? That I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. You gave up your safety, your comfort, quite possibly your very life, to remain here when everyone else abandoned me. Whatever justice we managed to secure against my family, it exists only because of your courage and loyalty." Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she attempted to deflect the weight of his gratitude, as she had done on previous occasions. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I did only what conscience demanded." "Perhaps," Alistair said, rising from his chair and moving closer to where she sat. "But conscience alone does not explain the depth of care you have shown me these past weeks, nor the courage you displayed confronting dangers that had nothing to do with your position as a housemaid. I have come to believe, Eliza, that something far more significant exists between us now, something that transcends the boundaries of station and circumstance that once separated us." Eliza's heart pounded as she looked up at him, uncertain how to respond to words she had both hoped for and feared hearing spoken aloud. "Your Grace, I am merely a servant in your household. Whatever feelings may have developed between us during this difficult time, surely propriety demands." "I care little for propriety at this point," Alistair interrupted gently. "I have spent my entire life bound by expectations and obligations, dictated by my title, my family, society's rigid structures regarding who deserves respect and who does not. Those very structures nearly cost me my life, Eliza, while the person who genuinely cared for my well-being was dismissed as insignificant, simply because of her station. I no longer wish to live according to rules that value bloodlines over genuine character." Eliza rose from her chair, standing close enough now that she could see clearly the sincerity reflected in his eyes. "What are you saying, Your Grace?" "I am saying," Alistair replied softly, "that these past weeks have shown me exactly what genuine loyalty and love look like, demonstrated not through grand gestures or empty words, but through quiet, persistent devotion, when every incentive existed to walk away instead. I find myself deeply, unexpectedly grateful for your presence in my life, Eliza Hartwell, in ways that extend far beyond simple gratitude for the care you have provided." Before Eliza could formulate a response, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, and one of the village men Alistair had hired for evening watch burst into the study, his expression urgent and alarmed. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but riders approach from the main road, moving quickly toward the estate. I count at least 3, perhaps 4, and they do not appear to be traveling for leisurely purposes." Alistair's expression shifted immediately from tender vulnerability to sharp alertness, the moment of intimate connection between them interrupted by the sudden reality of approaching danger. "How far?" "Perhaps 20 minutes, Your Grace, if their current pace continues." Alistair turned to Eliza, his eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and fierce determination. "Whatever this visit brings, we face it together." Eliza nodded firmly, her earlier vulnerability replaced by the same steady resolve that had carried her through every challenge since that first terrible night of his collapse. "Together, Your Grace, as we have faced everything else." They moved quickly to alert the remaining staff and secure what preparations they could manage in the limited time available, while outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew steadily louder against the quiet winter evening, carrying with it the promise of a confrontation neither of them could avoid any longer. The carriages rolled to a stop in front of the manor with a violence that scattered gravel across the entrance steps, and Edmund Whitmore emerged first, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief the moment he saw his brother standing upright in the doorway. "This is impossible," Edmund said, his voice tight with barely controlled shock. "You were dying. I was told you were dying." "I imagine you were told many things you found convenient to believe," Alistair replied evenly, his posture steady, despite the tension radiating from every muscle in his body. Margaret stepped down from the second carriage, her composure remarkably intact despite the evident surprise flickering across her features. Charles followed close behind her, his eyes darting nervously between his father and uncle, while Louisa remained near the carriage, watching the unfolding confrontation with an expression Eliza could not quite decipher. "Alistair," Margaret said carefully, "we came the moment we heard rumors of your recovery. We were overjoyed, naturally, though concerned that no word had reached us directly." "How curious," Alistair said, his voice carrying an edge of cold irony, that Eliza had never heard from him before his ordeal began. "That concern for my well-being only manifested once word spread that I had survived, rather than during the actual weeks when I lay dying in this very house, abandoned entirely by the family who claims such devotion now." Edmund's jaw tightened visibly. "We had urgent matters requiring attention in the city. Dr. Pell assured us there was little more we could do here that could not be managed remotely." "Dr. Pell suspected poisoning from the very first night," Alistair said, watching closely as the color drained slightly from his brother's face. "He has since documented this suspicion formally, along with substantial additional evidence that has been gathered over these past weeks." Silence fell heavily over the entrance courtyard. Charles shifted uncomfortably, while Margaret's composed expression finally began to crack at the edges, though she quickly recovered her measured tone. "Whatever wild accusations have been suggested to you during your illness," she said carefully, "I assure you, they stem from confusion brought on by fever, not from any genuine wrongdoing on our part." "Confusion," Alistair repeated slowly. "Interesting choice of word, given that a formal legal challenge has already been filed regarding the amended will, along with sworn testimony from a former employee of Victor Cole's office, confirming that documents bearing my signature were fraudulently prepared." Edmund's composure finally shattered entirely. "You cannot possibly believe some disgruntled clerk over your own family." "I believe evidence, Edmund," Alistair replied firmly. "Financial records showing systematic transfer of funds from estate accounts in the weeks following my collapse. Correspondence between yourself and Victor Cole discussing timing and dosage of a substance intended to ensure my death appeared natural. These are not the confused ramblings of fever, brother. These are documented facts, carefully gathered and formally submitted to proper legal authorities." Margaret's face had gone entirely pale now, though she attempted one final defense. "Whatever documents you believe you possess, surely this is a matter better discussed privately, among family, rather than paraded before household staff and strangers." Her pointed glance toward Eliza carried unmistakable disdain, and something within Eliza hardened at the implicit dismissal, the assumption that her presence somehow diminished the legitimacy of this confrontation. "Eliza Hartwell remained by my side through every terrible day and night of this illness you so casually abandoned me to face alone," Alistair said sharply, stepping slightly forward, as though physically placing himself between Eliza and Margaret's contempt. "She discovered the evidence that ultimately exposed this entire conspiracy. She sought medical guidance when no physician remained available to help me. She has earned far more right to stand here today than any of you, given how thoroughly you demonstrated your true feelings toward me, the moment you believed death was imminent." Charles finally spoke, his voice unsteady with something that might have been genuine remorse, or perhaps simply fear of consequences now closing in around him. "Father, I never wished for your death, I swear this to you." "And yet you did nothing to prevent it," Alistair said, turning his attention toward his son, with an expression of profound disappointment. "You sat in that dining room the night I collapsed, and you asked your uncle what would happen if I recovered, rather than asking how we might save me. Dr. Pell has also confirmed that someone matching your description visited his practice inquiring specifically about substances that might interact dangerously with the tincture he prescribed for my fever. What explanation do you offer for that, Charles?" Charles's face went ashen, his mouth opening and closing without producing any coherent defense. Louisa, standing silently near the carriage throughout the entire confrontation, finally stepped forward, her expression torn between fear and something that looked almost like relief. "Father," she said quietly, "I knew nothing of poison. I swear it upon everything I hold dear, but I suspected something was deeply wrong when we departed so quickly after your collapse. I said nothing because I feared what speaking against Edmund and Mother might cost me." Alistair studied his daughter carefully, searching her expression for genuine sincerity beneath the fear evident in her voice. "Your silence still allowed this conspiracy to proceed unchallenged, Louisa. Complicity through cowardice remains complicity nonetheless." Edmund, sensing the confrontation slipping entirely beyond his control, attempted one final desperate maneuver. Whatever evidence you believe you possess, Alistair, consider carefully what public exposure of this matter would mean for our family name, for generations of the Whitmore legacy, built through centuries of careful reputation. Surely we can resolve this privately, in a manner that preserves dignity for everyone involved. Alistair's laugh carried no genuine humor, only bitter recognition of his brother's true priorities even now, facing the collapse of his elaborate scheme. You attempted to poison your own brother, Edmund. You forged legal documents to steal an inheritance that was never rightfully yours, and even now, confronted with overwhelming evidence of your betrayal, your primary concern remains preserving public reputation rather than acknowledging the depth of harm you sought to inflict. This confirms everything I now understand about the character you have always concealed beneath polished manners and careful words. Peter Grant, who had arrived at the manor earlier that afternoon with fresh legal documentation and had been observing the confrontation from the entrance hallway, chose this moment to step forward, formal papers in hand. "Edmund Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "You are formally served notice regarding legal proceedings challenging the validity of the amended will you orchestrated, along with associated charges concerning fraudulent alteration of legal documents and financial misappropriation from estate accounts. Additional investigation continues regarding the circumstances of the Duke's collapse, with formal medical testimony already submitted suggesting deliberate poisoning." Edmund stared at the documents Peter extended toward him, his composure finally collapsing entirely into something closer to panic. "This is absurd. You cannot possibly prove any of this in a court of proper law." "The evidence already gathered suggests otherwise," Peter replied calmly. "Margaret Doyle, formerly employed within Victor Cole's office, has provided sworn testimony regarding the fraudulent preparation of the amended will. Financial records document the systematic transfer of funds from estate accounts following the Duke's collapse. Dr. Pell has formally documented his professional suspicion of poisoning based on symptoms observed at the time. Together, this evidence presents a compelling case that any competent magistrate would find difficult to dismiss." Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally shattered entirely, tears of genuine panic replacing her earlier icy calm. "Alistair, please, consider what this means for Charles and Louisa, for their futures, their reputations. Whatever anger you feel toward Edmund and myself, surely our children deserve some measure of mercy." Alistair's expression softened only slightly as he regarded his wife, years of shared history briefly flickering behind eyes that had witnessed too much betrayal to fully soften now. "I have already witnessed exactly how much mercy this family extends when circumstances prove inconvenient, Margaret. You discussed my death as casually as arranging dinner plans. Do not now appeal to mercy you were unwilling to extend when I genuinely needed it most." The confrontation continued for several more tense minutes, accusations and defenses exchanged back and forth, until finally Peter intervened once more, insisting that formal legal proceedings would need to run their proper course, rather than being resolved through continued argument in the manor's entrance courtyard. "I would recommend," Peter said firmly, addressing Edmund, Margaret, and Charles directly, "that you each secure independent legal counsel immediately, given the seriousness of the charges now formally filed. Continued presence at this estate serves no productive purpose and may complicate rather than resolve the legal matters currently unfolding." Edmund, recognizing the futility of further argument, finally turned toward the waiting carriages, his expression a mixture of fury and barely concealed fear. Margaret hesitated a moment longer, looking toward Alistair with an expression that seemed to search for some final flicker of the affection that had once existed between them, before finally accepting the reality of what her actions had irreversibly destroyed. Charles lingered longest, his eyes meeting his father's with genuine anguish. "Father, I am truly sorry for my silence, if nothing else." "Sorrow arrived too late to matter, Charles," Alistair replied quietly, though something in his tone suggested the door between them, while badly damaged, had not been entirely and permanently sealed. "Perhaps, given time and genuine accountability for your actions, some measure of relationship might eventually be rebuilt. But that possibility exists only through your actions moving forward, not through words spoken now merely because circumstances have shifted against you." The carriages finally departed down the long gravel drive, carrying away the family who had so thoroughly betrayed him, leaving behind only Louisa, who remained standing uncertainly near the entrance, uncertain whether she was welcome to stay or expected to depart alongside the others. Alistair studied his daughter for a long moment before finally speaking. "You may remain, Louisa, provided you are prepared to fully and honestly account for everything you witnessed and understood during these recent weeks. I offer this opportunity not because I have forgotten your silence, but because I still hold hope that genuine remorse might yet prove possible for at least one member of this family." Louisa nodded quickly, tears finally spilling down her cheeks, as relief and shame mixed together in her expression.
"Thank you, Father."
"I will tell you everything I know." As the last carriage disappeared down the drive and evening settled fully over the estate grounds, Eliza moved quietly to stand beside Alistair, watching the empty road where his family had just departed under circumstances entirely different from their earlier abandonment weeks before. This time, it was Alistair who held the power, who controlled the terms of engagement, who stood firmly rooted within his own home, while those who had betrayed him retreated in disarray. "It is not yet finished," he said quietly, though something in his posture suggested a burden had shifted, if not entirely lifted. "But it is no longer a battle I fight from a position of weakness and ignorance." Eliza reached for his hand, and this time, neither of them hesitated or questioned the propriety of the gesture. "Whatever remains ahead, Your Grace, you face it now with truth firmly on your side." Together, they turned back toward the manor, Louisa following quietly behind them, while Peter Grant remained near the entrance gathering his documents, already planning the next steps required to formally complete the legal reckoning that had only just begun. The magistrate's gavel struck the wooden bench with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire courtroom, silencing the murmured whispers that had filled the chamber throughout the lengthy proceedings. "Given the overwhelming weight of evidence presented," the magistrate announced, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed room, including sworn testimony, documented financial records, and medical assessment, "this court finds sufficient grounds to void the amended will in its entirety, and refer the matter of attempted poisoning to criminal proceedings against Edmund Whitmore." Edmund sat rigid in his seat, his face drained of all color, while beside him, the legal counsel he had hastily secured could offer only a whispered word of reassurance that carried no genuine comfort. Margaret sat several rows behind, her expression a mask of composed devastation, while Charles stared down at his hands, unable to meet anyone's gaze throughout the entire declaration. Alistair sat calmly beside Peter Grant at the opposing table, his posture steady and dignified, a striking contrast to the broken, feverish man Eliza had first discovered, collapsed upon the dining room floor months earlier. Eliza sat directly behind him, close enough that he occasionally reached back to briefly touch her hand for reassurance during the more difficult portions of testimony. The weeks leading to this moment had proven exhausting for everyone involved. Additional witnesses had come forward once the initial legal challenge became public record, servants who had previously feared speaking against the powerful Whitmore family, now finding courage once they understood formal proceedings were already underway. A former stable hand confirmed witnessing Edmund's suspicious visits to the estate wine cellar in the weeks preceding the Duke's collapse, details that further corroborated the timeline established through financial records and intercepted correspondence. Victor Cole, facing his own legal jeopardy for facilitating the fraudulent will, ultimately chose to cooperate fully with authorities in exchange for reduced consequences, providing detailed testimony that confirmed Edmund's central role in orchestrating both the document forgery and, more damningly, acquisition of the poison itself, through contacts within the criminal underworld that Victor Cole had reluctantly facilitated. Charles, faced with mounting evidence of his own knowledge regarding the poisoning attempt, eventually confessed to purchasing information regarding substances that might interact dangerously with common fever treatments, though he maintained throughout his testimony that he had believed this knowledge was intended merely to protect his father rather than facilitate harm. The magistrate, weighing this claim against the totality of evidence, ultimately determined that while Charles bore responsibility for his silence and passive complicity, insufficient evidence existed to prove direct participation in the poisoning itself. Margaret's fate proved more complicated still. While clear evidence demonstrated her awareness of the fraudulent will and premature confidence regarding the Duke's impending death, proving direct participation in the actual poisoning remained difficult to establish conclusively. The magistrate ultimately ruled that her complicity, while morally reprehensible, fell short of criminal culpability regarding the poisoning itself. though her role in the fraudulent inheritance scheme carried its own significant legal consequences. As the proceedings drew toward their conclusion, the magistrate addressed the full courtroom one final time. This court further orders immediate restoration of all estate assets and titles to Duke Alistair Whitmore, along with formal recovery of funds improperly transferred during the period of his incapacitation. Edmund Whitmore will face separate criminal trial regarding charges of attempted poisoning, with sentencing to be determined based on the outcome of those proceedings. The gavel struck once more, formally concluding the lengthy legal battle that had consumed nearly 2 months since that terrible night of the Duke's collapse. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Alistair remained seated for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of vindication finally achieved after such devastating betrayal. Outside the courthouse, autumn had given way fully to winter, snow beginning to dust the cobblestone streets as Alistair and Eliza descended the courthouse steps together, Peter Grant following close behind with the formal documentation that would restore full legal authority over the estate and its considerable holdings. "It is finished," Alistair said quietly, watching snowflakes drift lazily through the gray afternoon sky. "Or at least, this particular chapter has reached its conclusion." "How do you feel, Your Grace?" Eliza asked gently. He considered the question carefully before answering. "Relieved, certainly. Vindicated, in a manner I did not fully expect to feel, but also profoundly sad, that my own brother could harbor such calculated hatred beneath decades of apparent affection, that my wife could discuss my death with such casual detachment, that my son's silence nearly cost me everything. And yet," Eliza said softly, "you emerged from this ordeal with truth firmly established, with justice served as thoroughly as circumstances allowed." "Yes," Alistair agreed, turning to look at her directly. "And I emerged with something else as well, something I never anticipated finding, within the darkest days of my life." Eliza felt her heart quicken at the warmth evident in his expression, memories of their interrupted conversation, weeks earlier, resurfacing vividly in her mind. "Your Grace." "Please," he interrupted gently, "call me Alistair. I believe we have long since moved beyond the formal boundaries that once separated us." "Alistair," she repeated softly, testing the intimacy of his given name upon her lips for the first time. He reached for her hand, holding it firmly despite the cold winter air surrounding them both. "Eliza Hartwell, you remained beside me when every reasonable incentive existed to abandon me entirely, as my own family so callously did. You sought answers when silence would have proven far easier. You cared for me through the darkest days of my life, expecting nothing whatsoever in return. I have come to understand, through everything we have endured together these past months, that my feelings toward you extend far beyond simple gratitude." "Alistair," she said again, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, "I am merely a housemaid. Society will never fully accept. Society nearly allowed me to die alone and abandoned, deceived by those who should have loved me most, simply because they held proper titles and bloodlines," Alistair interrupted firmly. "I care nothing whatsoever for society's judgment regarding matters of the heart, Eliza. I care only for genuine character, genuine loyalty, genuine love. Qualities you have demonstrated more thoroughly than any person of noble birth I have ever encountered throughout my entire life." Snow continued drifting gently around them, as Alistair knelt carefully upon the cold courthouse steps, drawing a small velvet box from within his coat pocket, one he had evidently carried with him throughout the day's proceedings, awaiting this precise moment. "Eliza Hartwell," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple yet elegant ring, "you saved my life when everyone else abandoned me to die. You restored my faith in genuine human kindness when my own family had shattered it entirely. I am asking you now, not as your employer, but as a man who has come to love you completely, whether you would do me the honor of becoming my wife." Tears filled Eliza's eyes as she looked down at him, overwhelmed by emotions she had carefully suppressed throughout their months together, uncertain whether propriety or circumstance would ever allow such feelings to find proper expression. "Alistair, are you certain? This will bring scandal, gossip, resistance from every corner of society that values bloodline over genuine merit." "I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life," Alistair replied firmly. "I nearly lost everything, Eliza, my life, my legacy, my faith in humanity itself. Yet through it all, you remained steady beside me, asking nothing in return, accept the opportunity to see justice properly served. Whatever scandal society chooses to manufacture regarding our union, I will face it gladly, provided I face it beside you. Then yes, Eliza said, tears now falling freely down her cheeks despite the joy evident in her expression. Yes, I will marry you, Alistair Whitmore. He rose to his feet, slipping the ring gently onto her trembling finger, before drawing her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than any words could adequately express. Peter Grant, standing respectfully several steps away throughout this entire private moment, finally allowed himself a broad smile of genuine happiness for the couple before him. Months later, as spring finally arrived and the estate grounds bloomed once more with color and life, Alistair formally announced both his engagement to Eliza and comprehensive reforms to how the Whitmore estate would be managed moving forward, establishing protections for household staff and formal recognition of merit and loyalty over rigid traditions of bloodline and station that had so nearly cost him everything. Louisa remained at the estate, gradually rebuilding trust with her father through consistent honesty and genuine effort, while Charles, having faced his own separate legal consequences for his complicit silence, began the long process of proving through action, rather than mere words, that redemption remained possible for those willing to genuinely pursue it. Margaret, stripped of her position within the estate and facing significant social consequences for her role in the conspiracy, retreated from public life entirely, her once prominent social standing reduced to quiet, isolated obscurity. Edmund's criminal trial concluded with conviction on charges of attempted poisoning and fraudulent document alteration, resulting in lengthy imprisonment that effectively ended any possibility of the inheritance and power he had so ruthlessly sought to claim through calculated betrayal of his own brother. On a warm spring afternoon, beneath blooming trees that lined the estate's ancient gardens, Alistair Whitmore and Eliza Hartwell exchanged marriage vows before a modest gathering of genuine friends and loyal staff, individuals who had proven their character through actions rather than mere titles or bloodlines. As they stood together, hand in hand, formally declared husband and wife before witnesses who genuinely celebrated their union, Alistair turned to address the small gathering, with words that would come to define the new chapter of his life and legacy. True nobility, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet garden, was never a matter of birthright or inherited title. It exists instead within character, demonstrated through action, particularly during moments when no one else remains to witness that character, except conscience itself. My own family abandoned me to die, calculating my death as merely a convenient step toward their own ambitions. Yet one person, owing me nothing beyond simple employment, chose instead to stay, to fight, to believe that my life held value worth preserving, even when everyone else had already written me off entirely. He turned to look directly at Eliza, love and gratitude evident in every line of his expression. Eliza Hartwell taught me, through her unwavering courage and loyalty, that genuine worth has nothing whatsoever to do with title or blood, and everything to do with the choices we make when circumstances test us most severely. I am profoundly grateful and profoundly humbled to build the remainder of my life alongside a woman who embodies true nobility far more completely than any title I could ever bestow. As the gathered guests applauded warmly and Eliza wiped away tears of overwhelming joy, the newly married couple embraced beneath the blooming spring trees, beginning together a new legacy built not upon inherited privilege, but upon the genuine loyalty, courage, and love that had carried them both through the darkest days imaginable toward this triumphant, well-earned moment of happiness. A year had passed since the wedding beneath the blooming trees, and the estate that once echoed with betrayal now hummed with a very different kind of energy, one built on trust earned rather than assumed. Eliza stood at the tall windows of what had once been the Duke's private study, now shared between them as a place of quiet work and conversation, watching the first frost settle across the gardens below. She placed a hand gently against her stomach, a small secret she had been carrying for only a few weeks, one she planned to share with Alistair that very evening. The door opened behind her, and Alistair entered, carrying a letter that had arrived that morning from the city, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. "News from the prison authorities," he said, setting the letter down on the desk. "Edmund has petitioned for an early review of his sentence, citing good behavior during his confinement." Eliza turned from the window, studying her husband's face carefully. How do you feel about that? Alistair considered the question for a long moment, before answering honestly. Angry, if I am truthful. Part of me still wishes to see him suffer as thoroughly as he intended for me to suffer. But another part of me recognizes that clinging to that anger indefinitely serves no purpose beyond poisoning my own peace, and I have had quite enough of poison in my life already. Eliza smiled softly at the small attempt at dark humor, a sign of how far he had traveled from the broken, grieving man she had nursed through those first terrible weeks. Will you oppose the petition? I have not yet decided, Alistair admitted. Peter believes the court is unlikely to grant early release regardless, given the severity of the original charges. But I find myself wondering whether continued imprisonment truly serves justice at this point, or whether it has simply become another form of the same bitterness I am trying to release from my own heart. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and Louisa entered, carrying a small stack of papers related to the charitable foundation Alistair had established in the months following his recovery, an initiative dedicated to supporting household staff and workers across the region who had suffered mistreatment or exploitation from employers who viewed them as disposable rather than deserving of dignity. Louisa had thrown herself into managing this foundation with a dedication that had genuinely surprised everyone, including herself. The quiet, uncertain young woman who had once stood paralyzed with fear during her family's confrontation had gradually transformed into someone capable of genuine leadership and compassion. Her past silence transmuted into fierce advocacy for those who might otherwise remain unheard. Father, I have finalized the arrangements for next month's assistance program, she said, setting the papers before him. We will be able to support nearly 40 families this quarter, more than we initially projected. Excellent work, Louisa, Alistair said, reviewing the documents with evident pride. Your mother would have been astonished to see how thoroughly you have embraced this responsibility. A shadow crossed Louisa's face at the mention of Margaret, whose isolated existence, following the scandal, had grown increasingly withdrawn over the past year. I received a letter from her last week, Louisa admitted quietly. She wishes to see me, to attempt some manner of reconciliation. And what do you intend to do? Eliza asked gently, understanding better than anyone the complicated weight of family betrayal and the difficult question of whether forgiveness, or at least civil acknowledgement, remained possible after such profound harm. I do not know yet, Louisa admitted. Part of me still carries anger toward her, for the choices she made, for the silence she demanded of me, even as I watched Father suffer. But another part of me recognizes that she is still my mother, however deeply she failed in that role during the darkest moment of our family's history. Alistair reached over and took his daughter's hand gently. Whatever you decide, Louisa, know that this choice belongs entirely to you. I will support you regardless of the path you choose, whether that involves eventual reconciliation or permanent distance. You have proven yourself, through your actions these past months, to possess wisdom and character far beyond what I once believed you capable of demonstrating. Louisa's eyes glistened with emotion at her father's words, a stark contrast to the fearful, uncertain young woman who had once remained silent while conspiracy unfolded around her. She nodded gratefully before excusing herself to continue preparations for the following week's distribution of assistance funds. That evening, as autumn winds rattled softly against the manor's ancient windows, Eliza finally found the right moment to share her news with Alistair. They sat together near the fireplace in their private chambers, the same room where he had once lain near death, now transformed into a space filled with warmth and quiet contentment, rather than fear and uncertainty. I have something to tell you, Eliza said, taking his hand and pressing it gently against her stomach. Something that will change our lives once again, though this time toward joy rather than crisis. Understanding dawned slowly across Alistair's face, followed immediately by an expression of pure, unguarded happiness that Eliza had rarely witnessed even during their most tender moments together. A child? Yes, Eliza confirmed, tears of happiness gathering in her eyes as she watched joy spread across her husband's features. Our child. Alistair drew her into a careful embrace, laughter mixing with emotion as he processed this unexpected and wonderful news. After everything we have endured, after every betrayal and danger we faced together, this feels like the truest vindication of all, proof that genuine love and loyalty ultimately triumph over calculated cruelty and greed. A new legacy, Eliza said softly, echoing words Alistair had once spoken during their wedding ceremony. Built not upon inherited titles, but upon genuine love. Precisely, Alistair agreed, resting his hand protectively over her stomach. Our child will inherit far more than mere wealth or title, Eliza. They will inherit the knowledge that true character matters more than blood, that loyalty freely given carries greater value than obligation demanded by circumstance. Word of Eliza's pregnancy spread throughout the estate and surrounding village within days, greeted with genuine celebration from staff and villagers who had come to deeply respect both Alistair's transformed leadership and Eliza's continued compassion toward those less fortunate. The housemaid, who had once served quietly at the edges of grand family gatherings, now stood poised to become mother to the future heir of the entire Whitmore legacy, a transformation that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those dark early days, when her only concern had been simply keeping a dying, abandoned man alive through the long, uncertain nights. Peter Grant, who had remained a close friend and trusted advisor throughout the intervening year, visited shortly after learning the happy news, bringing with him updates regarding Edmund's petition for early release. The court has denied the petition, Peter reported, settling into his familiar chair within the study. The magistrate cited the severity of the original crime and insufficient evidence of genuine rehabilitation as grounds for maintaining the full sentence. Alistair absorbed this news with quiet contemplation, rather than the fierce satisfaction he might once have felt. I find myself surprisingly at peace with that outcome, Peter. Not vindictive triumph, simply acceptance that justice has run its proper course. You have changed considerably since I first met you within these very walls, Peter observed, studying his old friend with evident respect. The man consumed by rage and devastating betrayal has given way to someone capable of genuine peace and forward focus. I owe that transformation entirely to Eliza, Alistair said, glancing warmly toward his wife, who sat nearby working on documents related to the household foundation. She taught me, through her example, that dwelling perpetually in anger serves only to poison one's own future, while genuine healing requires the courage to release what cannot be changed and focus instead on building something better moving forward. As winter gradually gave way once more to the promise of spring, and Eliza's pregnancy progressed toward its natural conclusion, the estate that had once witnessed such devastating betrayal continued its steady transformation into a place defined by genuine compassion and merit, rather than rigid tradition and calculated cruelty. Charles, having served his own legal consequences and completed a lengthy period of supervised community service, gradually began rebuilding tentative relationship with his father, small steps of genuine effort, slowly earning back trust that had been so thoroughly shattered. Margaret remained largely isolated, her petitions for reconciliation with her children met with cautious, measured responses, rather than immediate forgiveness, though even she seemed to demonstrate, through slow and halting correspondence, glimpses of genuine remorse that suggested perhaps redemption remained possible for even the most calculating among them, given sufficient time and genuine effort. On a bright morning in early spring, nearly exactly 2 years after that terrible night when Alistair Whitmore had collapsed abandoned upon his own dining room floor, Eliza gave birth to a healthy daughter, whom they named Grace, in quiet acknowledgement of the mercy and second chances that had defined their extraordinary journey together. Holding his newborn daughter for the first time, Alistair looked toward Eliza with an expression of profound gratitude and overwhelming love. She will grow up in a household built upon truth rather than deception, upon genuine loyalty rather than calculated ambition. Whatever legacy we ultimately leave behind, it will be one worth genuinely inheriting. Eliza smiled, exhaustion and joy mixing together as she watched her husband cradle their daughter with tender care. A legacy built upon everything we fought so hard to protect, and everything we discovered together along the way. Outside the window, spring sunlight illuminated gardens now blooming with vibrant color, a fitting symbol for a family that had emerged from devastating darkness into a future defined not by inherited privilege or calculated cruelty, but by the genuine, hard-won understanding that true worth exists within character and loyalty demonstrated through action, regardless of station or circumstance, and that sometimes the deepest betrayals create space for the most unexpected and profound forms of love to finally take root and flourish.